Okay. Yeah, welcome everybody again. My name is Alex. I'm here with Alexander Hoyal. The call today is called Charge the Real Criminals, How the Law is Killing Us. That's a fairly controversial statement, but in a lot of ways, it's not an exaggeration. Because we're here today to talk about potentially the greatest, crime of the millennium, you might call it, the conversion of our planet into a planet which will support radically less people, radically fewer cultures and species and resources. And this is going to have knock-on effects on everything. So it's an honor to be here with you today and to have a panel like we do to speak on this. My connection to law is a lot more tenuous than our speakers today, but before I came to Just Up Oil, I had just graduated law school, and I had noticed in my course that they would introduce us to this intricate system of precedent and statute, and it was all very finely balanced against each other and interrelated. And you would write these essays, and you would read this analysis, and you would get so granular, and you would get right into the process of that. And we wouldn't ask these big questions about is what the hell we're doing right or wrong, because this system is not innocent. Lawyers, the legal system, justices, and jurisprudence are undergirding exploitation, extraction, and the whole thing is allowing for and preparing for and causing the deaths of billions of people due to climate breakdown. So if we are all here united by this idea that the law is more than just an arbitrary set of rules written down by someone that we just have to follow because that's what it said, that the law is more than just these rules enforced by a government with a monopoly on power, that it is something higher, that it is something more aspirational, that it should be something just and fair, and it should promote peace, not tyranny and death and all the things that we're going to see over the century, well, then you're in the right place, because that's exactly what we're here to talk today about. It seems that reading people like Damien Short and others, experts here that we have today, a lot of growth in the law comes from tragedy, international law especially. You have genocide scholarship following World War II. You have some ecocide scholarship following Vietnam and the American use of defoliants. But we don't have the opportunity to wait till the climate crisis rolls over us before we address it and before we change the legal system to address it. We all know the law doesn't turn a blind eye to everyone and to everything. They seem happy enough to throw innocent activists in jail for protesting on the road for a matter of minutes. But they do very little to address the climate criminals, the heads of these companies like BP and Barclays, who are preparing the earth to support fewer people. So why is a law, both international and domestic, that aspires to be more, so silent on this greatest crime? What can we do about it? I'll leave that to our esteemed panel. Up first, we have, truly an honor, we have a leading sociologist in the entire world, a leading genocide scholar. His name is Damien Short. He's the co-director of the Human Rights Consortium. He is a professor at the School of Advanced Studies. He is a regular academic contributor to the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Human Rights. He is a convener of the British Sociological Association's Rights Study Group, along with like 10 other things that you can Google. We're going to include a link to his website in the chat. He has written books. He has written articles. This guy's the real deal. So we're very lucky to have him. And without further ado, I'm going to invite Damien Short to tell us about his take on this topic. Thanks so much.
No, thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for tuning in. It's obviously a crucially important topic, and one that rightly deserves a lot of our attention. So I just thought tonight, rather than showing more slides, which I've been sort of doing all day, I just talk about my journey through these two really important topics, genocide and ecocide, and then hopefully try and build a picture of how I see the connection between them. And then obviously in the Q&A, we can deep dive into aspects of that. But I think the reason why I wanted to sort of do it via my own story was not because it was I see it as particularly important, but because it highlights the connections. And certainly for me, it really brought home the importance of the concepts as well as the law itself. Because for someone who was originally trained as a lawyer, I often say I was going to be a lawyer and then I saw the light. But generally speaking, I take a sort of socio-legal approach towards the law. I see it as something that is deserving of study, and also I think one of the things I find most interesting is looking at how it's made, and we'll get into some aspects of that and the repercussions of that later on, no doubt. Okay, so where did it all start? Well, it started with my original trip around Australia when I was somewhat foolish, early 20s, British backpacking type, when I thought Australia was there to be explored and discovered in a way which essentially involved fun and very little serious activity. And what I saw there was shocking, actually, and it was something that I hadn't seen as a child, even in apartheid South Africa, the sort of treatment of indigenous peoples. And they would often, in discussions I had with them even back then, before I started in the world of academic work, their discussions would often involve the word genocide. And I knew very little about it at the time. And I thought, right, well, okay, that's interesting, because it didn't really necessarily square with the understanding I had, which was, I suppose you could say, much like a popular understanding, which was largely like mass killings. And they had a much richer and more involved understanding of genocide, and they felt that it was a term which accurately described their suffering as a colonized people. And interestingly, even back then, they would mention the fact that their environment and their lands, the erosion of their lands, the erosion of the environment, the destruction of all means of cultural reproduction because of the loss of land was something which really struck me. And they had absolutely no problem at all describing that in terms of genocide. And then when I returned there many years later as a student, I became really interested in some of the rather awful responses to that that I saw in the Australian press and also in academic discourse as well. And in particular, I was struck with one quotation, which I still remember to this day, where Indigenous peoples were accused of, quote, dramatizing their suffering using the language of genocide. And I really found that quite astonishing. So at the time then I thought, well, is this really the case? And beginning my academic journey, then I thought, right, well, let's look into this concept a little bit more and see whether that was actually a fair. It struck me as a terrible description of Indigenous people's use of a term. And I then discovered actually that in many respects, their understanding was very close to that of the person who originated the concept, Raphael Lemkin. At the same time as I was studying that, I came across the phenomena that is now known as Canada's tar sands. And the same language was being used then by Indigenous groups. In fact, I've subsequently written articles on it. And I think one of the phrases that really struck with me was a slow industrial genocide, right? So Indigenous peoples are describing their suffering as a slow industrial genocide. And I thought, right, okay, this really needs further into academic investigation and looking into Lemkin's understanding. So subsequently then I moved into the field in great detail and looked at Raphael Lemkin's work and those who've looked at his, what was then at the time, his unpublished work. And there were a number of things that really struck me and really did bring home the notion that Indigenous peoples actually had a very close understanding of genocide, and it undoubtedly did capture their experiences. So, for example, Lemkin had a very strong sense of the importance of culture. And the reason he was really pushing for genocide to become part of international law was to protect national minority cultures. For him, the most important part of the convention was the cultural methodology, because for him, if you destroy the culture, you destroy the genos, and that is the genocide element. And that could be That could be accomplished by a number of means, of which a cultural method was just one of many possible methods, i.e. also so was the physical killing. And even though physical killing is something which has dominated popular understandings of genocide, there was not at all a decent understanding of Lemkin's concept. Lemkin was very, very much of the opinion that destroying the culture is at the heart of what genocide actually is. And that could also happen through environmental destruction. Now, that environmental dimension in Lemkin's work wasn't as strong at the time as cultural erosion, but the whole idea that conditions of life could be imposed on a group such that the group would be destroyed was part and parcel of Lemkin's thinking. So I was working a lot then with Indigenous groups, trying to sort of change the narrative and to say, well, actually, this is not an exaggeration. Their position is one that could adequately be described as a period of colonial genocide. And then the other element of Lemkin's work, which again isn't necessarily as well emphasized as other aspects, is the fact that he saw it as an inherently colonial phenomena. Okay, so genocide itself was intrinsically linked to colonial processes. So for Lemkin, those two elements were absolutely vital to understanding what he would call the master concept of genocide. Now, moving on to then how this is translated into law, one of the other things I've been really, really interested in is how Lemkin's broad understanding became the Genocide Convention, which is a much, much narrower beast. And there's been a number of really good books that touch on these themes and highlight what sociologists would call the social construction of the convention. And it was a very messy process with lots of political interests involved. And it ultimately resulted in a very diluted version of Lemkin's idea, where the cultural element is virtually eradicated, not completely. There are still the crime of moving children from one group to another with the intention of wiping out the group. But largely, the cultural method was removed, and it sort of ripped the heart out of Lemkin's convention. And it was a political decision he had to make: either lose his convention or accept the fact that the cultural method would not be part of the ultimate convention. It was politics. And ultimately, he had to, as he said, allowed the idea to be removed, which was very dear to him. And it was no wonder it was dear to him, because it's culture that animates the genos in genocide. So that was the sort of, the background to my interest in genocide, and my sort of passion, really, I should say, in trying to change the narrative around genocide. So it's not just about physical killing, and it can capture the sorts of experiences that Indigenous peoples have suffered through colonization. Then moving on then to the idea of ecocide. In doing this work, I also met a wonderful lady who sadly died far too young, Polly Higgins, who was one of the early advocates for ecocide to sit alongside genocide as an international crime. And I was working in some of the UN archives at the time when I met Polly, and Polly said, I've had this little note from a journalist, and it said that actually ecocide was discussed within the UN system back in the 70s. And at the time, she knew that there was the backdrop of Vietnam, etc., and Richard Falk's mention of it. But then it sort of, the trail became somewhat cold in terms of the institutional history of ecocide in the UN system. So myself and a number of other students did some background digging, and over many, many weeks worked with Polly, and we built up what was essentially like a missing history of ecocide in the UN system. And again, what that highlighted in essence was more politics, surprisingly. And again, a move to, first of all, include ecocide in the revised version of the Genocide Convention, and then looking at it as a potential amendment to ultimately an amendment to the Rome Statute, which is sort of where we are today. So ecocide is a campaign. The Stop Ecocide campaign is one that I work with alongside this genocide work. And myself and Martin Crook have written a book which now sort of tries to take Lemkin's ideas and sort of bring it up to date a little bit more, and make the argument that you can have ecologically induced genocide. which we've overall described as the genocide ecocide nexus. And our work now is to sort of, highlight the fact that environmental and ecological destruction can itself be genocidal. And we argue that, this is a whole area now that needs much more exploration and academic work alongside the Stop Ecocide campaign to try and change the law to have something like ecocide as important as genocide in the international arena. But we are under no illusions that itself will be an intensely political process, I should imagine. And we can talk about that in the Q&A as well, if you're interested. I have quite a lot of anecdotes about the nature of these kind of political discussions in the international arena, which will highlight some of the potential difficulties with ever making this, an international crime. And just to finish up then, of course, the other big issue is to take the example of Indigenous Peoples Declaration, which took over 20 odd years to negotiate at the international level. That was just a declaration. Ecocide is attempting to make the kinds of abhorrent corporate behaviors that we're all interested in criminal. So there's a very big difference between a declaration, the international level, and an international crime. So lots to think about, lots to discuss around that, but that's generally my relatively brief introduction. Okay, I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Damien. Really appreciate being here, and thanks for all your remarks. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker. So we're really lucky to have one of the most preeminent barristers right now on the climate, on the environment, Paul Powsland, here today to join us. So let's introduce Paul Powsland. Paul is the founder for Lawyers for Nature, which is basically, maybe Paul can speak more about this, but a group that tries to democratize access to really powerful legal advice for natural bodies themselves and for activists who try to protect them. He's a barrister at Garden Court Chambers. He was described in one news article regarding his activism as the hammer-wielding barrister. So we are very lucky to have Mr. Powsland here with us today. Very powerful advocate. I'm going to turn it over to you, Paul. So from your perspective as a practitioner, we're wondering if you have an introduction and some brief thoughts on the topic today.
Yeah, I do. I should probably just clarify that hammer wielding comment. It was to remove a legal obstruction that a developer had put on a footpath near me. I did email them quite a few times, asking them nicely to take it out until the hammer came out. Sometimes direct action against unlawful behaviour is necessary. So this is quite a big topic, and probably one of the most important topics of our time. Why is the legal system, both national and international, out of kilter with the climate and the necessary action we need to take over climate? And how do we change that? I don't know if I can even begin to start covering it in 5 minutes intro, but I'm also very intrigued for any questions that you have. And I'm really, I often find the questions are the more interesting part. So do please respond with any questions you have to this. Some brief thoughts are, there are a number of, if you like, doctrinal or conceptual reasons why the legal system animated discussion with Roger Hallam through the streets of London on a JSO protest one time, and we were saying my connection's unstable. Is it okay?
It looks like it's recovered a bit now.
And we were talking.
It looks like it's recovered now. Let us.
Okay, hopefully it'll be all right. Just at the wrong moment. So we were talking about this exact issue. Why can't the legal system act on the climate? And a key reason is one of causation. Someone's saying they lost a minute. Okay. I was saying a key reason why the legal system can't act properly on the climate is one of causation. Now, causation means, in ordinary terms, obviously, whether one thing caused another. But there's a difference in legal causation to what's called factual causation. So you may think that there's a direct cause between one act and another, for instance, putting carbon dioxide in the air and people dying, both here and in the future. But the law doesn't necessarily see legal causation in the same way as factual causation. And also, legal concepts were often come up with many years/centuries ago when the world was very different. So we can illustrate this issue over looking at the defense of necessity. So the defense of necessity means where you've committed a crime, you can say, well, I had no choice but to commit the crime because I was trying to prevent a greater harm. But the problem is that that defense of necessity is relying on case law that's hundreds of years old, when generally to prevent a harm you had to be doing something very immediate to that harm. So for instance, if you broke down the door of a burning building to go and rescue the people inside, you would not be guilty of criminal damage for damaging that door. But the problem is as we found out in the modern era, many activists are finding that the defense of necessity doesn't cover their climate activism. For instance, we know that actually smashing the door of the Shell headquarters is necessary to save the lives of many people, not just to save them from a burning building, but save them from a burning planet. But the law does not recognise that, by and large, as being valid necessity. And that's because that legal system was decided back when it was very difficult to cause harm to others, except in an immediate way. Back in the 18th, 19th centuries, it would be very difficult to do an act that would resonate or cause harm to other people more than, a few meters, at maximum a few miles away from where you are. The idea that we can do actions which not only harm people on the other side of the planet, but harm people hundreds of years into the future, maybe thousands of years into the future, is completely at odds with our current legal system. And that's a key thing that we need to change within it and to begin arguing against. So that's the conceptual part, but there's a deeper issue, which is one about politics, because the law is just politics made into a set of rules, effectively. And I think sometimes we forget the extent to which the law can be changed. There are no entrenched laws in this country. Parliament can make or unmake any law that it wants. And that is a valid law by and large under our constitution. Maybe a few exceptions to that, but by and large, Parliament can do whatever it wants. So the problem is of course the fossil fuel industry is in many ways winning the political battle, and that therefore means that they win the legal battle. The final issue, and this is the one that's perhaps closest to my heart, is the fundamental fact that the legal profession, by and large, is there to uphold and to support wealth and power. And we know that the fossil fuel industry is the richest, most powerful industry that has ever existed. And we know that an industry that is that wealthy and that powerful will not go down without a fight. And that is very unfortunate in a time where the legal profession is fundamentally putting itself in service of those with money, not with those who not trying to act for justice effectively. And there are many examples of this, but a key one that we can see is the use of injunctions recently. I'm sure many of you will see people saying, well, Parliament made the law and the courts and the lawyers just have to obey it. But for those of you that don't know about how injunctions started out, it's from one line of the Senior Courts Act, Section 37, which says that the courts can grant an injunction wherever it is just and convenient for them to do so. That's all Parliament said. That's all the law says. And yet, from that one section, they have invented, over the course of the past 40 years, an entire new category of law with this kind of half criminal, half civil area of law to effectively deter and punish environmental and other forms of protest. And I think it's a very good retort to those that just say, well, the law exists and lawyers just have to interpret it and judges just have to interpret it. Because given the power to grant injunction where it's just and convenient, did they find it just and convenient to make injunctions to stop water companies pouring sewage into our rivers? No, they did not. Did they find it just and convenient to make injunctions to stop the use of fossil fuels that are going to kill hundreds of millions, possibly billions of people? No, they have not. Very coincidentally, the courts and lawyers have found it just and convenient to invent a whole new area of law to effectively deter and to punish environmental and other forms of protest. And I think that's very interesting. And I have last year now, started a group which came out of Lawyers for Extinction Rebellion, is now called Lawyers Are Responsible, which is a group of lawyers trying to get proper action from the legal profession on the climate crisis. You may have seen that we signed a declaration last spring where nearly 200 lawyers said that we would not work for new fossil fuel projects. Not even saying we won't work for the fossil fuel industry, we won't work for new fossil fuel projects, given we know such projects will lead to the deaths of millions of people. That's scientifically established. And we also said that given the huge unfairness in the current system and the way that the government is targeting climate protesters, we wouldn't prosecute climate protesters. Now, that may sound very reasonable to all of you, but it was greeted with utter horror in many parts of the legal profession because of what is called the cab rank rule, which is the idea that lawyers are supposed to represent anyone who comes to them for justice. Now, if that rule genuinely existed, it would probably be a good one, because everyone does deserve representation. But of course, lawyers being lawyers, there's one key exception to the rule that you must represent anyone who requires it, regardless of the morality of the situation. And that is if they can pay your fee. And your fee is their fee generally is far, far beyond the means of most ordinary people in this country. Many commercial lawyers now charging £400 or £500 an hour for their services, which 80–90% of the population can't afford. So effectively, the net effect of this cab rank rule, except for money, is that the richest, most immoral people will always get representation, and those who are poor, even if they require representation, and even if their cause is good, they can go get fucked, is basically what the legal profession is saying to them. And that is what I've been arguing against for the past year. And every time I go on Twitter and sort of make these arguments, I'm sort of hounded by various King's Counsel saying, oh, everyone deserves representation. I'm like, oh, well, would you like to represent my friends who can't afford you? Like, no, I have to charge my fees, of course. So I think I need to wrap up. So just to go into briefly how we are trying to deal with that. We have been holding protests outside the main city solicitors firms who are acting for the fossil fuel industry. A group called Law Students for Climate Accountability started in the US, basically categorizing the worst law firms for acting for fossil fuel industries. They amazingly did a report for the UK last spring for solicitors, and are hopefully extending that to barristers this year. And we effectively used their research to basically go down each solicitor's firm and say, okay, who are the worst offenders here? Protest outside their firms peaceably, politely, just handing out leaflets to staff saying, do you know what your firm is doing? And we've secured meetings with a number of firms to discuss what they're doing. We are going to hopefully extend that to the barristers' chambers this year. And the most interesting thing we've started doing recently is targeting recruitment. Many people in the top barristers and solicitors firms don't really care that they're seen as acting immorally and indeed acting in a way that's going to cause the deaths of millions of people. But what they do care about is recruitment. And young people really generally care about the climate crisis much more than older people because it's their future that's at stake. So we've started attending law fairs and just leafleting students about the worst law firms and telling them not to go there and to tell those firms why they're not going there. And my colleague and Lawyers Are Responsible wrote an amazing article. Monica, she wrote an article, Blowing Up the Talent Pipeline, which is, I genuinely believe, one of the most important pipelines we can blow up. Blowing up the talent pipeline, not just to law, but also to many of the supporting professions that are helping fossil fuel firms to commit their crimes. And that is something that if we can start tackling the talent entering the legal profession, that's the best way we can get firms to change the work they're doing, and actually changing the work that lawyers are doing and starting to even up the balance, even not even saying they should not act for the fossil fuel industry at all, but evening up the balance so it's even 50-50 between acting for the fossil fuel industry and those that are against them, could make a huge, massive systemic difference to the ending of that fossil fuel industry. And I think is a crucial win for potentially for climate activists. So that was quite a lot to cover, but I hope I covered it all in as much detail as I could, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. So much of what you said there, ringing like very true with our experiences. They're bringing in these firms to go through this loophole with injunctions, for example. Let me just replace the spotlight. And it's so interesting what you just said about the cab rank rule as well. It sounds like it's more of a Rolls Royce than a London cab they've got. Thank you so much for coming today. Hopefully we'll hear more from you in a second. Our next speaker, we're going to introduce...
I'm going to steal that quote about the cab rank rule. That's a great one. It's more of a Rolls Royce than a cab. Yeah, exactly.
You can have it. All right. Our next speaker is he's kind of a climate activism pioneer. Sorry, I don't know why I spotlighted you with me. I didn't do that with the previous speakers, but welcome, John Fuller, amazing, founder of Climate Genocide Act Now. This guy's fearless. He walks right into UK police stations, hands them a dossier of evidence that actually the government should be responsible for committing genocide under the Genocide Convention, and maybe he'll speak a bit more about that. So really amazing individual. Has worked with Plan B in the past, and basically won't let them get away without answering and having being recorded. They ignored this information. So we're very lucky to have John Fuller here today. I'm just going to remove my spotlight and leave it to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me okay. Alex, wave if you can't. Yeah, we're all good. Okay, right. So the Climate Genocide Act Now, we delivered a dossier of evidence in 2019 on the anniversary of the Nuremberg trials in November 2019 to a number of police stations around the UK. 39 people took that into their local police station. And the key point that we argue is the complete annihilation of low-lying island states an act of genocide? Is killing 400,000 people a year through climate breakdown, is that a crime against humanity? Is driving 140 million people into hunger and starvation in the Horn of Africa by collapsing agriculture, is that a crime against humanity? Is it a crime against humanity, in all probability, to kill hundreds of millions of people through climate change? And is it a crime against humanity? Is it genocide to potentially kill billions of people? Because if the Professor James Hansen 10 degrees Celsius paper's right, then we are looking at killing billions of people. So is annihilation genocide? As Damien said right at the very beginning, the complete destruction of an island, it has gone. An island state completely goes. Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Kiribati, the Maldives, and many others. Is that an act of genocide to just completely destroy everything that is there? The churches, the graveyards, everything to do with the culture, it's all gone. Is that genocide? So back in 2019, we looked at the law and we read through the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And there are concepts in there about direct intent and oblique intent. Direct intent is, I hate you and your people, and I'm going to kill you all, drive you all from your land. Oblique intent is climate change. That is where you do not necessarily hate the people of Kiribati or Tuvalu, but you know that if you pursue your economic policies, if you pursue your fossil fuel interests, you know that you're going to contribute to the annihilation of those nations. You know that it is impossible for you to achieve your objectives, your personal and economic objectives, without that occurring. It is a necessary outcome. Even if you don't want it to happen, you know with certainty it's going to happen. You know because your scientists have told you, because the victims have begged you not to do it at international conferences. And when you heard all that, you carried on. And you decided that you'd make it worse by expanding some polluting industries like aviation. There are others as well. So to us, within Climate Genocide Act Now, it was an act of genocide. It was an act of oblique intent, which is written into the legislation, but it was very close to direct intent. Article 30, as I say, deals with direct intent and it legislates for oblique intent crimes. You can be prosecuted for that. And people have been in previous genocide trials. And that is brought into the UK legislation by virtue of the International Criminal Court Act 2001. So we say the law is clear. If you've got a group of politicians or business figures who intend to contribute towards the complete annihilation of a low-lying island state or destroy agriculture, you can be prosecuted. And we put that to the police. And their reply came very quickly in December 2019, that for there to be any chance of a prosecution, a successful prosecution, there had to be intent to commit the crime. And they were referring to direct intent. And we kept on pushing them throughout the whole of 2020 on this core point about oblique intent is written in the legislation. We kept quoting the legislation at them and they kept on ignoring it. And they did so willfully and deliberately. They knew they were wrong, but they thought they could get away with it. And this is really important to anybody that takes any kind of dynamic action to try and stop the key climate criminals. If you take an action with JSO or XR, whoever it may be, you know that the law should have been acted on back in 2019. I'll come to that in a moment. But so there's a lot to our case, but I'm going to jump right the way through to September 2022, when Sir Mark Rowley was the new Met Commissioner, and he was appointed on promise to police without fear or favour. So we submitted an updated dossier of evidence to him and said, well, since you agreed to police without fear or favour, you've been recruited on this basis. Will you now commence the criminal investigation that we asked for? And he allocated it to the war crimes team that handles this in the Met Police. And they again said, no, there's got to be intent to commit the crime. So they tried to do the same thing. Now, there were a lot of trials taking place by 2022, a lot of people going to court because of dynamic action they've taken with XR, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil and others. And judges would quite often lecture people and say, you have no right to take the law into your own hands. The law applies to all. And courts and the criminal justice system have to act without fear or favour. And they would lecture our people and say, no one is above the law. So we wrote, wherever we heard the name of a judge and the court where they sat, and they heard a dynamic action that one of our groups had taken, we'd write to that judge. And we would say to them, everything you have said is completely false. You've been completely undermined by the police, the Metropolitan Police, because they have trampled on all four of those main arguments that you use when lecturing our people. Now, we don't know exactly what happened next, but what we do know is the Metropolitan Police, up until December of 2022, kept on saying to us, no, go away. In December 22, we believe the judges must have said something to the Met Police, because they then said, oh, right, we'll get our lawyers to send you a detailed explanation. Between March 2023 and July 2023, correspondence went backwards and forwards between the lawyers acting for the Met Police and our group. Now, it's not just a small group of us here. We are advised by professional lawyers with specialist knowledge in this field. So I can't claim that all of these arguments came out of courtesy of just my poor little brain. So we were given a lot of assistance. And there were 5 basic arguments. I don't think I've got time now to go into them here and now, but I will say that one of probably the most important arguments the Met Police use, or their lawyers use, is it's not for the Metropolitan Police to tell the elected government of the day what it should and should not do. And our argument was that you think that your loyalty is to that democratically elected government of the day, but it's not. Your loyalty is to Parliament. Parliament passes the legislation that all of us have to adhere to. And it doesn't matter whether this is COVID restrictions or Partygate or any other issue like that. All of us are supposed to adhere to the laws that are passed by Parliament. And you, Metropolitan Police, have no right to pick and choose which laws you'll enforce and which you will not. Well, they were well and truly stuffed. So their response in July 2023 is, we're not going to talk to you anymore. And that is what we're up against. That is the reality. Now, we're not the only group that are taking action along these lines. The UK Youth Climate Coalition has a case against BP, and they took it straight to the International Criminal Court because BP is international. And we think the International Criminal Court may have accepted the UK Youth Climate Coalition case because you get 12 months in which to either accept or reject a case, and the 12 months was up at the end of December. So we're well into January and they've not rejected it. So we're hoping that it will be logged as pending, but they've not rejected it. Now, the UK Youth Climate Coalition case uses the same legislation that Climate Genocide Act now is using. That's the Article 30 stuff about oblique intent. So the key point now I'd like people to think about is that this has huge implications for any of us if we end up in court. None of us would have taken the action that we did if the police had acted back in 2019. None of us would have ended up in court. It is wholly the fault of the criminal justice system that when we end up in court, that we are there. It's their fault. It's not ours. And what's worse is when you stand up in court, if you are in court and you, with JSO, whichever group it is, a key point to make to the judge and the jury is it gets worse than that. That not only have we proven to the police that they should have acted back in 2019, and if you had acted, then we would have never taken the action that we did. The additional point is that once this was proven to you in July 2023 that you were wrong, you knew you were wrong because you said you're not talking to Seagan anymore. You carried on. You carried on protecting the politicians. You carried on arresting and charging climate activists, and the CPS continued to prosecute. And you, Your Honour, the trial judge, you carried on allowing trials to happen. So this is a corrupt criminal justice system that protects the killers and prosecutes those trying peacefully to stop the killers. So these can be very uncomfortable messages to convey into a courtroom, and a lot of professional lawyers, barristers will be reluctant to put it in quite those brutal terms. But if you're self-repping, you can be, you've got to be polite, but you can be very robust in the language that you use in court. And that is increasingly what our people are doing. We have some people from JSO are being very, very forthright, really pushing this. We know that so far our evidence that we give to people has resulted in one case being dropped by the CPS, and we know that it's contributing towards some acquittals. But we've got to work harder. All of us together have got to work harder to make sure this gets into as many trials as possible. It's the key point that people need to make is that when your first part of your defence is that you want your Article 6 rights to a fair trial, and it's impossible to have a fair trial in circumstances such as this. Article 6 is an absolute right, and the courts should take that seriously. And if they don't, then we want that logged. We want to have reports of that, so that quite quickly, quite soon, we can go back to the courts and say, well, we want all these convictions quashed because you didn't take any account at all of the Article 6 issues. So we're fighters, and the police hate us, and they probably wish us ill, but we're not going anywhere, and we're going to keep fighting. And that's us. I look forward to the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over, I think, to Gail.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, there's some kind of Zoom thing. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, John. Really inspiring what you said. We're so glad that there is someone like you and everyone at CGAN and UKYCC and all these different groups who are not letting this thing go uncontested. And it's horrifying. And it feels like the larger the crime gets, the harder it is to address in a way, because the more enmeshed into the system it is. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspective. We're now passing to a true, pioneer of the climate movement, founder of a little group called Extinction Rebellion. It's possible you may have heard of it. There's only 1,150 chapters or XR groups worldwide. So truly one of the most successful global and international climate campaigns and movements in history, I imagine. So we're so honored to have them here. They're also working with a new program called XR Being the Change, which we will link to in the chat in a moment, as well as some other links about Gail's work specifically. Yep, we have Gail Bradbrook here today. We're very honored, and I'll leave it there. And please let us know what you think about this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It's good to be here, and maybe I'm just feeling with that volume of information just to slow down and breathe for a second. I don't know if people like doing this, but if you sort of wriggle your toes in your shoes or slippers or whatever, it sometimes helps you just to reconnect with the earth. I was on trial 3 times last year, so I've been at the sharp end of the UK's legal system. I was found guilty twice, and I'm happy to talk about any of that. And I also have a 75-page document that has a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about in a bigger format, so everybody's welcome to that. I've already produced it online. I think what this panel is really about, in my overstanding, as my friends say, is when you're looking at African friends say, is when you're looking at something from a bigger perspective, is the raising of legal consciousness. We know about having social consciousness or political consciousness. This is legal consciousness. It's been defined by African jurisconsuls. They're trained lawyers who act on behalf of their communities. And it was interesting listening to Damien talking about Indigenous people defining genocide, and then Lemkin steps in, and then from what I understood, I haven't heard that story before, makes a compromise. I understand there's politics. And really, who is it that gets to decide which law is which and whether law is just or not? Foundationally, what you're talking about is what's called critical legal theory, which is that there is no such thing as the law, and we must be careful about talking about the law as if it's a thing. It is, as Paul was alluding to and talking about, a system of power. It doesn't have to be our law. We can put two fingers up to it if it, as the people whose shoulders we stand on have done. We can say it's not our law, and beyond that, we can create our own law and our own courts. And I don't mean to say that's a trivial thing to do. Of course, it's not. But as these law courts are increasingly both the site of repression and resistance, and those of us that are in them, there are attempts to silence us, it's really important that we look at this whole thing from a wider perspective, from critical legal theory. You have had some great victories, although I think every case brings its own story. So whether you found guilty or not, I think, celebrating any activist who goes through that process. The one defence left for many of us is the defence of consent, and they are taking that to the higher courts to basically get rid of it. So the direction of travel is set, and it's the direction towards increasing authoritarianism. A change in government's unlikely to change this at all, I think. Now, I won't get into it in detail, but I think a talk that will be shared that I've given last year, looking at systems and data analyses and the sort of pathology that is behind the climate crisis and the wider crisis and the collapse that we're in. When you look from that lens, you realise that you can't bargain with the system. It's not going to do the right thing. It's not able to do the right thing. We can do our actions to highlight and to reveal and to show what it is, but it's a system that's in collapse. Jen Bendel's new book, Breaking Together, I highly recommend, shows that we're already in collapse. And what is it going to collapse into? Most likely a form of authoritarian surveillance capitalism, eco-fascism at best. It's not a good thing. And or just fall into pieces, into chaos. So, they'll tag activists. They'll increasingly use so-called community payback and things like that, high fines and injunctions, etc., to try and pressurize us to stop. So, how do we respond to that environment? Of all the things that are happening here, and I celebrate them all, a missing piece, and that's why I want to speak to this, is that what we have to do at these times is bring out a visionary alternative of institutions, of courts and of law that are being developed by the people. And just from a systems perspective, to say that can be what's known as a third attractor. It can support a system to collapse it into something better. So it's really important. That's why we talk about XR being the change. And they can be fed by local citizens, courts and so on. So we're talking about tribunals. Now, this is not a new idea. It's important to say that. And I have had my legal consciousness raised by organising with African jurisconsuls and a very beautiful and powerful law as resistance panel that my colleagues in something called Prailer put together about just over a year ago, that can also be shared, where you'll see folks of African heritage talking about what critical legal theory means to them. And I think it's a very sort of common pattern in our well, I don't want to get into the details of this title that I'm going to use, but wet eco whiteness, in the sort of whiteness of the climate movements, to I think we're inventing something new or coming up with new stuff. It's already been come up with, and we often fail to recognise history and be led and organise and struggle with people who've been in struggle against coloniality for many years. So in that way, sort of recommending as well the book The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh, who will put together sort of genocide and colonial history and climate change as three topics to look at together. I also highly recommend Hospice in Modernity, but I am a bit of a book nerd. So in terms of historic tribunals, the idea is Ubuntu Gotlas. It's community-led law where the community define, make, and shape and advocate for legal strategies and processes in our best interests. So I think that we're in a real. I'll come back to that point in a second, actually. So we can also define our own law, and in my 75-page document they gave to the court, knowing that they dismissed pretty much every page, which they did, I also produced with help a draft law of conscientious protection, because that's what we are. We're conscientious protectors, as my dear friend who was mentioned earlier, Polly Higgins, also defined during her work and her time with us. So we did have such a thing here. The Russell Tribunal was looking at the Vietnam War. There's been tribunals in Burkina Faso. There was a moving example from Hawaii. I think I will fail to pronounce that properly, but it's the People's International Tribunal for Hawaii in 1993. So there are examples that we can draw from. So basically what I'm saying as an overarching point is that I think our movements stand at a choice point. We can keep focusing on the systems of power and asking them and hoping that by highlighting what they're doing wrong, they're going to change, that these systems of power will give us justice. They're not designed to do that. It's not built into how they work. We've talked about injunctions. We've talked about law not being applied. You also have the vast world of secrecy jurisdictions when people can go offshore and have different forms of law. You know, it's not our law, it's the law of the powerful. It doesn't mean all law in this country is bad and wrong, but that's the general gist. So do we keep focusing on that and hoping that's going to get better? Certainly we should take out cases and try and hold things back. But part of what we need to do, as things fall to pieces, as they are and as they will, is create the alternatives. And that's the thing that helps to inspire us that something else is possible, because we made it. And we really have to realize that nobody's coming to save us. Nobody's going to apply law in a decent and honourable way. We are fucked. But we can go down together and we can create some beauty on the way. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. Really appreciate you coming and sharing some words. And it's really incredible. I mean, you've seen so many different things and had so many experiences in the climate movement, and we're so excited to see what's going on with these different projects and the international solidarity element. And so often that is forgotten in this movement, and there are activists all over the world doing far more than people do in this country or country like the US, and are punished for it far more harshly. So thank you so much for your joining today. I think it's time now for the Q&A, basically. Apologies, I think we're running a little bit long, but Indigo, would you prefer to go, sorry to ask you, but before the Q&A or after? Do you have a preference? Or
if I just speak now, because that would be good. I've had a very long day.
Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. So
is that okay?
Sounds great. Sounds great. I think we'd all like to hear basically your addition to this. So before we kind of diverge into some other topics. So yeah, introducing next our own Indigo Rumbelow. I assume a lot of the people on this call are from JSO, and so a lot of you probably know who she is already, but co-founder of Just Stop Oil, co-founder of Insulate Britain. So, you know, a real campaigner, a trailblazer, and is taking an interest in this topic and is coordinating some campaigns on holding the legal system accountable. Recently took like Ron's been doing, took a dossier of evidence to the Met, or began negotiations anyway. And so we are very blessed to have Indigo here, and we'd like to hear from you, Jessica. Thanks so much.
Hey everyone on the call, and yeah, thank you so much for everybody's contributions this evening, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you, the people, are thinking about these ideas, because they're big ideas that will shape where these ideas go will shape the future of humanity. And I just want to take a moment to think about our friend Marcus, who isn't here this evening, who is sat in prison. He's been there for over a year, I think 1 year, 3 or 4 months now, for demanding that the UK government stop licensing new oil and gas, and then again to think about the people who are walking free. Rishi Sunak, who has said that he wants to extract every single last drop of oil out of the North Sea, is sat in his home with his family this evening while Marcus is sat in prison. And time and time again, many people, like I'm sure hundreds of people on this call, have marched down the roads, they've held signs, they've organized peacefully, and they've been taken by the police in the morning from their homes. They've been arrested and held for sometimes 1, 2, 3 days on remand. They're electronically tagged and monitored as they walk through the streets. And they are sometimes given lengthy prison sentences. And all of this is designed to make us feel ashamed and to make us feel like criminals and to make us back down from bringing to light the most important issue that we all face. And instead, the people who unknowingly pursue oil and gas continue to go about pretty much unabated. So the kind of idea that that this call is about is the fact that new oil and gas is killing us. That's kind of broadly accepted by all of the writing on the climate emergency, on the climate catastrophe. The proposition that we're putting to you today is it's not that it's just it's not that billions of people are going to die. Is that billions of people are going to be killed. So in the first instance, something happens. It's out of our control. There's a big disaster and billions of people die. Okay, who do we put before the court? I don't know. There's another instance, and this is what we're saying that's happening, that people, namely Rishi Sunak, the other energy ministers who are signing the paper saying, yes, we want to pursue new fossil fuel projects in the middle of this climate emergency, knowing that it will lead to the deaths of billions of people. We're saying that these people are responsible for killing the people that John Fuller was mentioning here earlier, the people who are living on the small island states, the people in sub-Saharan Africa, the people in Bangladesh, whose cultures will be destroyed, whose land will be decimated and unlivable, and who will be forced to live in extreme heat. And those people will have to flee, or they will have to attempt to stay and risk everything. So it's a bit of a bombshell, really, on the climate debate, isn't it? It's like, if people if this was generally accepted idea, this would be changing the way that COP conferences were being run. It would be changing the decisions that our government ministers are making, and it would be changing the way people look upon fossil fuel executives. I think that our job as Just Stop Oil is to make the public storm which will hold these people to account. And let's just think about because it all feels very implausible, doesn't it? Why would people being arrested bring this issue to light? Surely that's a job for lawyers. Surely that's a job for the politicians. Well, let's just look at the post office scandal that I'm sure everybody here on this phone call, has been following. It wasn't the government ministers who held the post office to account. It wasn't the legal system that held them to account. It took an ITV drama to get this thing turned around. And that's what our protest is. That's what it does when it's pushing this issue into the fore and making it completely unignorable for people every time they turn on the radio, every time they open the newspaper, and also it pushes the issue into the courts. I'll try and try and be brief. So we, the kind of history of this campaign to charge the real criminals in Just Stop Oil. In October last year, we sent a letter to Mark Rowley saying that we will be starting a campaign of civil disobedience unless the police take action to investigate the real criminals. We had no response beyond the Met just going at us on Twitter. And then 5 weeks later, after hundreds of people have been marching on the streets, and after tens of people have been standing in the courts and saying to the judges, I should not be here in this dock, you should be charging the real criminals. And after the Met spent £20 million on their policing operations, we were invited in for a meeting with 3 representatives of the Met, 3 people in the Met, and we said, the only way we're going to stop this campaign is if you investigate the real criminals. We're still waiting to hear back they've taken the issue, they're going to look at it, and they're going to give us a response in due course. But as we all know on this call, we're taking this action because we have very little faith in the system as it stands, knowing that the law is there for those who can pay for it, and there for those who wrote it at the moment. So yeah, we are going to be if you have a court case upcoming, going into your court case and speaking your truth and really putting it to them, knowing in your heart that you've taken action to protect life and harming life that are walking free, really hold that, and we'll continue to push this message out there. And if you're sitting here tonight thinking, no, I'm not going to be able to do that, I'm not going to march with Just Stop Oil, but I want to do something, please, you could join our court support team and take notes in court. It's really vital that we have key notes and we follow these twists and turns so that we can support people better through the court process. And yeah, we're not going to let this campaign go. We're going to be continuing on in despite of the repression. You can sign up on the main page of the website if you are feeling inspired to want to take action with us, as we over the next few months we'll be bringing this issue to the power holders. And if none of these things you can do, then please donate to Just Stop Oil and keep our campaign running.
Okay, thank you so much, Indy. You can do all those things to help the campaign, along with a lot of the other amazing people on the panel today. We're not going to let them just ignore this and push it away and get away with not being mentioned. We are going to annoy the crap out of people and hold people accountable for what they're doing, which, as Indy says, is knowingly causing the deaths of hundreds of millions of people to billions of people. So our first speaker was Mr. Damien Short. So I was wondering if we could ask you, you spoke about, obviously you're working right now with research that relates to extractivist projects like the tar sands and these other things that are happening across the world. I was wondering if you had any opinions on the relationship between, well, I feel like you've already spoken on it, but would you be interested in outlining a little bit more this relationship between cultural erasure and genocide, and why it's not more of a component that is part of modern genocide theory? If you have any additional thoughts on that, or we can go to something else. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no problem. It's it's sort of resurrected over the last, I don't know, couple of decades really, with a sort of post-colonial school of genocide scholars, and then looking back at Lemkin's work, they saw that actually it was all really about cultural destruction. And I think in terms of the sort of current situation we're in, one of the things that really struck me was, I think it was Barbara Rose Johnson argued that culture has been humanity's primary adaptive mechanism. I quite like the way she put that. And if culture is being eradicated through effectively, genocidal processes, then our ability to adapt to things like changing climates is drastically reduced as local knowledge disappears. And that really, really struck me, actually. And that's something that's come out of lots of interviews and discussions I've had with Indigenous groups over the years. The importance of cultural vitality and cultural difference was something that, that was what fueled Lemkin. He called it the loss of future contributions to the world. That's what he was worried about, was losing that. And that's really, really, for me, the clincher, really, in terms of the cultural dimension, the cultural method of genocide. But often it's used in sort of like legal language as like a lesser form of genocide, or they'll call it ethnocide, like that. And it's not, it's just a different method. And Lemkin had a very strong sense of different kinds of methods of genocide. So I react strongly against that idea that it's like a lesser form, that mass killing is the worst and cultural eradication is lesser. And it's not, it's just a different method of the same process. So yeah, it's been a lot about narrative change, etc. And I think it has changed within scholarship. Has it affected more popular understandings? Not quite yet, but I certainly think in terms of the criminal tribunals and things like that, it's still obviously strictly adhered to the convention. The convention largely doesn't have that cultural method in it in the way that Lemkin intended. But a lot of people involved in the ecocide campaign are very, very interested in that cultural dimension. And are thinking about ways in which the two the crimes interact, etc. On that note, I've just put in, I know this is going off the original question, but I've just put in the chat a link to the new proposed ecocide bill in the UK, which we've been involved with, and it's significantly different to the international definitions. It's based on the international definitions, but there's important differences, so it's worth checking it out. Obviously they're just a draft, and it's got I suppose little chance of success, unfortunately, but it's all part of the narrative change, and hopefully it will have some positive impacts. Also, we've been involved in the Scottish consultation today, so things are shifting, and I'm quite pleased about that. It's taken a long time. I think it's worth having a look at the language of that particular bill, because it's a lot better than I was originally expecting it to be, and it is seeking to target the corporations, not just the individuals, because one of the things that's less well appreciated with the international campaign is that's going to target individuals, right, and not corporations. And obviously a lot of what we worried about is the corporation. On that note, the other thing I should say, before you ask me another question, I suppose, is if anyone's not read David White's book on ecocide and the corporation, I strongly recommend you do it. He's a guy that I've worked with as well, has impacted on this bill too. Really, really excellent book. But basically his argument is that whilst we talk about the structures of capitalism and colonialism, his argument is if we don't kill the corporation, it'll kill us. Which is quite a provocative book, but it's based on his analysis of corporate law. And it's very, very interesting, given that we're all fully aware, as some of the early speakers mentioned, about the impacts of corporate lobbying on law itself. It's an interesting notion. Anyway, sorry, I've gone off tangent.
No, I mean, you're one of the experts for a reason, and it's great to have you with that kind of depth. So thank you so much. If it's okay, we'll do one round of this kind of unique questions. And the next person to go was Paul, I believe. So would it be okay if I asked you, Paul, and if you prefer to adapt the question, feel free. But this lawyers are responsible thing seems to hit so closely at the theme of tonight. The law being responsible, and thus its agents, being lawyers and judges and everything else. How would these corporations or government bodies that are carrying out this climate catastrophe, how would they fare if powerhouse lawyers like yourself stopped representing them, defending them, working for them? How would that go?
I think, as I said in my talk, it would make a massive difference, not even necessarily about stopping them getting represented, but it would make a massive difference if the amount of lawyers' time or money spent was evened up between both sides. It's not actually known, even at the moment, how much lawyers are acting for one side or another. I tried to get the Bar Council to do research on this, and they just flatly refused. My guess is that it's probably 80-20, maybe a 90-10 in favor of those actually committing the climate crisis or carrying out the climate genocide as opposed to those that are opposing it. But we don't really know. Even just evening that would make a massive difference. And the work we're doing around trying to target recruitment and also trying to get employees of law firms to actually question what their law firm is doing could make a big difference, because even if these firms don't necessarily stop doing fossil fuel work overnight, if they restrict it or if they do more pro bono representation of climate activists, that would be amazing. And if people, it would be great, for instance, if we could have a central repository of somewhere where people who want assistance in either activists or those doing climate related cases who were seeking representation could actually write that down, so we could actually then match those with lawyers who are up for actually doing this work. Also, if you want to get involved in helping to show why the cab rent rule is a pile of nonsense, all of last year, the head of the bar, so the chairman of the bar council, basically was completely against lawyers are responsible, and kept just literally every time he spoke or wrote an article, it was like the cab rent rule, the cab rent rule. Everyone deserves representation, and he even called those who signed the declaration virtue signalers in his final email of the year. So I think it'd be really cool, given that he loves representing people so much, if as many different climate activists as possible write to him at his chambers in written terms and ask him via his clerks to represent them for a fee they can afford. Obviously, if you can only afford £50, because that, and you can explain why, this is my income, this is how much I earn, this is how much I can afford, will you represent me? And I'll put his email, I'll put his details in the chat and you can find him. And if literally hundreds of people were to message him and say, I'd like you to represent me in my claim in the magistrates court, I'm desperate for representation, you've spent a whole year saying how important representation is to you, will you represent me? And then just tell me his answer so I can tweet it out and we can see how much he actually likes representation in practice. Because actually it kind of looks like he basically just likes representing the fossil fuel industry to make hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds. But of course we have to put it to the test first before we can truly know what his actual stance is.
What you're telling me is I have a trial coming up, and if I just send this guy an email, I'll have a real barrister on my side. He'll say yes, probably.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to guess what he's going to say to you, but either way, it's going to be interesting, isn't it?
It will be interesting. Thank you, Paul. I'm holding back a laugh. That's funny. Okay. So John Fuller, from Climate Genocide Act Now was our next speaker. Thank you, sir. I was going to ask you, and yeah, again, feel free to adapt the question or take it off on a different tangent, but it seems like you've had so much contact with these, with the police, for example, directly, this policing body. What have you learned from interfacing with these institutions directly, speaking to these people? Are people in the institutions like the police and the Met, are they concerned themselves? Are they privately concerned in putting on public face? They've heard this information that public order could break down. It could make policing, it's almost impossible in climate crisis conditions. What's your opinion on it? Is there a schism in any way in that institution that you are kind of operating on?
Well, I do have a very personal experience relating to this. It's something that's bubbling under between the Metropolitan Police and myself, and it's running quite separately to CGAN. And it's a death threat, and a death threat made in person to myself and my wife. And the evidence does take it back to the Met Police. So I have a very, very poor view now. My attitudes towards the police have changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. I used to have one of those people who used to have a very, very high degree of respect for the police, and my attitudes have changed a lot. I know full well that there are a lot of police officers who really are worried about climate change. They're very worried. They know that it's going to get very bad indeed. And there are other coppers who just think, I just want to drive my car and fly abroad on holiday in planes, and I don't really care about it. So you're going to find a cross-section of society there. But I have a very jaundiced view right now of the police. So maybe I should be asked that question again in a year's time and see if I feel a little differently. I will just say that I know a lot of people involved in our movement. I've been involved in this for 45 years. And the kind of people who get involved and here for a long period of time, we are the kinds of people who respect all life. We're not the kinds of people who would be inclined towards violence. I'm not. Virtually everybody I know is not inclined towards violence. We're peaceful people. We respect life, and it is an outrage when our people are beaten up in the street. When the police stand back, see what happens to JSO people. It's an outrage when the police do nothing at all about threats of violence being initiated or incited by the Daily Star or the Sun, where people, commentators say, well, they encourage people to run over JSO people. They encourage their readers to punch JSO people in the face, and they don't denounce people who attack JSO in the street. The violent criminals are in the national media, the right-wing press, the Sun, the Daily Star, and others, Mail. And we have violent criminals in the police. And so I do have a very jaundiced view right now. My attitudes have changed, but yeah, we are up against a very, very hostile, powerful group of people who serve fossil fuel interests, and I'm afraid some of us are going to get worse than a punch in the face. But as for me, I will never back down. I will never give in, because any kind of suffering I go through is immeasurably less than somebody who's trying to survive in the Horn of Africa right now. I have no right to give in. None of us do.
Wow, I need to take a deep breath after that. Yeah, that was amazing, Jonathan. But so sorry to hear that that's happening, and yeah, just give you my best. Thank you for your contribution. We'll circle back in a bit. So the next person to speak was the amazing Gail Bradbrook, and so we have here an opportunity to ask someone who helped found again a campaign and a movement which, in terms of its breadth, its spread, its virulence, was so incredible in this climate space. Like over 1,100 chapters, and it's all over the world. I'm from Texas, and it was practically the only thing that made it to Texas. So we talk about something like the law. It's so dry. It goes all the way back to these understanding on that level. It feels like such a dry topic, but it's so essential to this whole thing and holding these groups accountable. Do you have any thoughts on, being that you're so good at, again, building this thing that can spread, how you would get the word out about ecocide and genocide and things, and what are the aspects of campaigns related to that that you would advise would be the most important?
Alex.
That was a confusing question.
Before I say that, can I say two things? It may get said elsewhere, but anyway, in February we have Larch and our other tunnellers who were part of JSO actions in Crown Court, and the JP Morgan women who JP Morgan window breaking women are in court as well. There's probably other Crown Court trials, but those two I know. So court support very wanted and welcomed. I will highlight things like that in my Telegram channel, and people will get that link. And the other thing was, I was looking through the Q&A, and somebody had asked me a question about how to do the route towards people's law and tribunals, and I have got a short paper on it, so I can send it to Alex so that can be shared. And I tried, sorry, that person who asked it, I pressed the wrong button, and I think I eradicated your question, but I read it with care. I think you were generally asking me a question about how to get the word out, Alex, but I think there's a bigger question, isn't there? It's like, what the fuck do we do now? And maybe how come was it that XR sort of lit a spark, and other things might feel like a slog? I think maybe that's the question. Because what I want to say, and it's a big, and it's something that could take a long time to say, is that one has to focus towards the systems of life, not the systems of anti-life, the systems of power. And the systems of life have magic in them, and you can tap into that magic. What the fuck does Gail mean? It's an esoteric thing to say. If you want a very, very nerdy and long read, Ian McGilchrist, The Matter with Things. But what I think you have to do is attract rather than push more than anything. You draw people in with something that you co-create, which is it has vision and wisdom and agency and togetherness in it, and it is the world of our longing. And in the early doors, Exile had that spirit, and it was co-created, and it was prayed over, and it was called in, and it is witchcraft. So I'll just leave it at that, because that probably sounds a bit bonkers, but I mean that wholeheartedly. You create a container that attracts people. That's what our job is right now. It's bigger than any mechanistic thing that we might want to do. You can't build a machine to defeat a machine, but what we can do is lean into the systems of life and learn from it and become the hyper keystone species that we're meant to be. I could sit and have several bottles of wine if I weren't detoxing and really talk that through, what I mean by that, because it sounds a bit daft otherwise, but I'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you.
No, I think we were just getting the keys to the matrix there. So I don't think it sounded daft at all. Thank you so much for sharing. Our last panelist is the amazing Indigo Rumbelow, obviously founder of the organization whose Zoom we're on right now, co-founder. So I have a question for you, Indigo. Hope that's okay. But if you think you'd like to answer a different question, please do. We see this kind of what's the word? Like friction with getting anything done on this issue, whether it's international law, domestic law, climate litigation, like all these different things. It's so difficult to make progress. What would you say to the idea that the law is something that can't be moved quickly? And I would kind of point to something that we've seen over the past 2 years personally, that the law can move very quickly to criminalize innocent people going out on the road. And that actually, we've seen some incredible growth on that. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that dichotomy.
You've answered the question, Alex. I'm not going to take loads of time on it. It can move very, very quickly if people want it to. Yeah, it can very, very quickly, and it can also be surprising. And the courts are being surprised at the moment from the amount of jury trials that are being found not guilty and acquitted. And they're obviously trying now to suppress people's defense in court. I think it's a real sign that they're on the back foot, and they know that the age of fossil fuels is fucking over, and they know that we want to live in a world that we are proud of living in, and we don't. And if people in the courts, if the judges aren't going to start just wholesale kicking out these climate activist cases, if lawyers aren't wholesale going to just spend all of their time pro bono trying to take these fossil fuel companies to court, then and if we don't see the end of the fossil fuel era very quickly, it's going to destroy itself. Ultimately, it's going to destroy itself. So yeah, which way will it go? Will we be able to find legal solutions, or is it going to destroy itself? I believe it can move very quickly. We just need to find those weak points within the system and mobilize people around these issues. So just really encourage everyone who's come along today, if any of this has sparked your interest, go and talk about that in your workplace, go and talk about that with someone you meet, and let's try and make this this conversation the beginning of the end.
Thank you. So that was our first round of individual questions. We are a bit over time, so I was thinking of kind of trying to condense the last two questions, which were quite big questions, general questions, into maybe condense them into one answer if possible, because they do relate to each other. So all things considered, cards on the table, each of you represents largely like a different area. Like we have some incredible, people come from different places, different careers, perspectives. So in your kind of niche, how you relate to the law, why has the law been so reluctant to impose penalties and hold people accountable for basically causing essentially the end of the world, by some counts, right? What are the main obstacles in your patch, and then how do you think they can be overcome, however unlikely or however likely? I know that's a huge question, but I think it's a crucial question. So if you have any thoughts on that, we'd love to hear it. Should we do the same order, go around? Damien, would you be happy to start us off?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is though.
No,
yeah, I mean, in the work that we've done, especially looking at the Genocide Convention and the Indigenous Rights Declaration, there was a particular phrase which I think really stuck with me, and that's that law is the product of the balance of power between political interests. And that was a really interesting way of phrasing it, and I think it's certainly something that I've seen in my work. So a more democratic and representative approach towards it would go a long way, but that's an incredibly hard thing due to all the things that we mentioned already, especially the sort of the power of political lobbying. And I think there's one thing that really stuck with me in my early years when I was researching in the UN. There was a big debate about whether Indigenous people should have group rights, and there were various representatives of sort of Western states making arguments that was essentially philosophically unsound, because human rights are based on are for the rights of the individual, and therefore you couldn't possibly give them to a group, etc. So they're making these sort of philosophical objections, and you have to be pretty naive to imagine that politicians and state delegates had any interest in philosophical integrity, and there was something else behind it. Ultimately, I managed to get an off-the-record interview and said, look, why are you so against the idea of group rights? And this state representative just said to me, oil companies. And that was it. So basically, the lobbying was so powerful that they were more interested in denying Indigenous groups rights to their own lands, largely because it would have meant that the oil companies, the extractive industries, would have to negotiate with them to extract. And that was, something that was really disappointing to see in the international arena. And that was in my early days. And since then, I've seen more and more of it. So for me, that's the big problem, is to somehow magically stop the corporate lobbying that is part of the construction of legal systems. How do you do that? I don't know. So, can't be more optimistic than that. But that's the problem for me. Sorry.
Yeah. That is a big problem. Thank you so much for being here today. Should we pass to Mr. Pausland? Do you have any thoughts on this in your area as a practitioner?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very wide question, but I would say a key part of the puzzle is we need to turn lawyers from a group that is by and large currently fanning the flames of the crisis to those that are actively trying to prevent it. And to me, it's always been a deep tragedy that some of the most intelligent, hardworking people in our society are not only making things worse, leaving that aside, they're not actually contributing to what is needed of them in this moment. The transition that we as a society have to make is really going to be difficult, and we need all of those people to be in service of that transition. So turning lawyers into causing harm to trying to prevent it, to me, is a big thing. How we do that, open question. Lawyers Responsible have got some funding this year to actually get a campaigns manager, which is really great. So it's not us just doing it all in our spare time anymore, but it is a really limited number of lawyers. We haven't got as many as we want right now. So actually, if other activists can support us at actions, we'd actually really appreciate your solidarity and support, even if it's just handing out leaflets or helping us hold our banner and things. All our actions, because we're lawyers and we're lame, are legal and peaceful. If you want anything a bit more action based, go to Justin Hoyal. But we're all very lame in our actions. The other thing as well is that I think we need to inspire lawyers more a bit as well. Lawyers are an egotistical bunch, and I'm always a bit annoyed that more of them haven't thought, actually, you know what, this greatest crisis in the history of humanity, maybe I can be a part in making that change. I think we need to inspire more lawyers in that, and we need to make lawyers fall in love with nature more. I'd love something that takes lawyers out into nature and actually gets them to connect and really fall in love with it, because I think that will make them be that change in the system. And we need to inform them. I think honestly, a lot of them just don't have a clue how bad it is. I don't think lawyers are evil people. I don't think the majority of them would make money out of the crisis if they knew how bad it was. Many of them, from my conversations with them, they just don't understand. Getting that, which has always shocked me because they're supposed to be intelligent people, but again, it's about what you've read and you know what you've actually covered rather than just your base intelligence on things, I think. So something we'd love to do at in the legal profession is holding briefings for lawyers to actually like get them to understand what the crisis is, and ideally from scientists, maybe more than activists, to really break through their barriers on actually listening to and finding out the gravity of the crisis we face, so they can step up and play their part in it. So yeah, all different ways you can potentially get involved. Do get in touch if you think you can help with any of those.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, like super concrete, and you can see how that culture is protecting what's going on. Thank you so much. So now we'd love to hear from. So we have gone. Oh, sorry, John. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll be a little bit briefer. My feeling is that there's enormous power in the fossil fuel industry. They know how crucial it is to control the media. Right now, there's a battle taking place for control of the Telegraph Group, media group, publishes the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, and various other periodicals. And it is incredibly pro-fossil fuels. So this battle taking place for control of it is being partly waged by individuals in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates. And it's obvious why they want control. Why all billionaires and fossil fuel executives want control of the media, because that is how you convince a large proportion of the population that climate breakdown isn't as dangerous as it really is. And that's how you convince more gullible people that somehow groups like JSO or XR are a threat when they are obviously trying to save people's lives, trying to save our young. And that ought to be fundamental to our culture. It surely is fundamental, isn't it, that our primary objective is the protection of our young, and yet somehow we've been convinced, a lot of us in society have been convinced that that is not somehow our primary purpose. So I would say it's the billionaires who have extreme fossil fuel interests, and they control the media. I would say that the Conservative Party is the political wing of the fossil fuel industry. And I would say that in terms of an answer to this, I don't think we know what the answer is, how we break through this. I would say that you've heard a number of speakers here, and each of us are providing a new perspective on this. And there are other groups outside that are also part of this jigsaw. And it is a jigsaw. And we try everything, and we just don't give in. We just keep going, keep trying. And we don't give in, and it is a jigsaw. At some point, we're going to make a breakthrough. And when we do make that breakthrough, everything changes.
Thank you, John, so much. I hear in your answer talking about a specific pillar like the media, but also just saying that we need to have a bit of a fighting spirit. Really appreciate being here today. So next, we'd love to hear from Gail. Do you have a take on this as well?
Yeah, I sort of lost what the question is, but I've got
I'll
to say despite that. I'll just say some stuff, if that's
okay.
all right.
Do you want me to repeat the?
No, it's fine, honestly, because I'm just going to say the same stuff anyway. Yeah. First of all, we're an ecosystem, and we're all creatures in it. John is definitely some kind of creature that does that. Paul will be a cheeky squirrel. Etc. So, and ecosystems and creatures within the ecosystems, they have their times to be in the foreground. The butterflies come out in the summer. So we need to think like and act like an ecosystem more. And we're often in our silos. So it's always great to hang out together, but they're rare, and that's not right. We know that the Atlas people have been funding massive amounts of climate denial, and it's coordinated globally. That's the other thing. It's a globalized, financialized, kind of capitalist colonialist modernity. It's global, so we have to think globally as a global ecosystem. I think a global ecosystem would have emergent properties, which would include what I talk about as a sort of immune response. So if we want to throw our bodies at the system in warrior mode, and that's certainly some of the energies that are here and absolutely needed, part of what that can do when you do it here is reveal the system. But you probably can't change it. You can reveal it, and that's helpful, but we then build alternative systems. Where there's larger amounts of power is when you focus on economic power, so taking on the finance system, and building economic power is harder, but the places where there's more likelihood of that is in the global south, where most of the resources are extracted. So we can spend at least some of our time focused on where power lies in other places. I'm new to a lot of geopolitics. It's a study. We have to learn history and geopolitics and economics and something. You'd have to learn it in my nerdy bookish way. A lot of that's by talking to other people. You can find out. We've got a formation called PRALA, Planet Repairs Action Learning Education Revolution. We can link to people, but there's different ways of learning. A lot of it gets done through connection. But if you look, for example, what's happening in the Sahel in West Africa, I keep banging on about this. Like, our movements don't seem to really know about this or focus on it and think about it. There's an active Pan-Africanist decolonial struggle in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger at the minute. And and the sanctions from Europe. And where are our movements in learning about that? Why is it happening? How is it being spoken about? What's the reality of it? You know. If you look at what Jason Hickel talks about in terms of and others, but in terms of degrowth and how that links to true decolonization, it's happening right now. So, like, part of our attention needs to be in these other places and in backup and support, especially when in our names they're being sanctioned. Right, Niger, for example, is insisting that it's uranium supplies are being paid for normal market rates rather than rip off, and the French have been booted. Anyway, it's an interesting story. I can send stuff on this piece. For myself, I think there's something really big as we collapse about focusing in our communities, because fascism's rising amongst us. So we've got to do work on communities. Collapse-aware communities that are linked, we call it local linking, that are in resistance. And I would particularly be focused on non-payment strikes, getting, water bill strikes, that's what, so we understand we don't have to fucking put up with this shit, but it has to be organised at quite local levels. That, when the mortgage bills go up, you had movements in, I think in Spain, where people didn't pay their mortgages and people's houses were protected. We really have to build that level of solidarity, and it's not something that shows fast results. And I think we're a bit used to and wanting, and it was almost like, although XR had loads of sort of successes, it's almost like it's caused problems. I think we sort of expect results, whereas actually this is about the rest of our lives. We're gonna have to build and build and build as things fall to pieces, and keep looking at each other and be in spirit together, so as much as, like, when you got that ferocious drive energy, get out in the streets and work with it, but also look at the place where you become a more alive person and can be in community and relationship and linked with your wider family. That piece needs to happen as well, I think. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I think.
No, it does immensely, and there's so many levels to that. I feel like you're talking about linking a lot of things together that already exist and harmonizing, and so really amazing. Thank you so much. Indy, up to you, and I wonder if you might be able to keep final remarks a bit shorter, because we're running out of time. But thank you so much. Yeah, Indigo. What do you think? So some of the big blockages we see in our way, and our kind of idea, or your kind of idea for how they might be surmounted or dealt with.
Yeah, it's only going to happen when we come together. And, like, if you've never come to a Just Stop Oil call ever before, or if you've been 20 times before and you've taken action with us, like, we're just continuing to build that community, and there's going to be these regional actions coming up soon, so it's a good time to re-engage. If not, stay tuned, and there's going to be lots more stuff on this attack of the legal pillar of power coming soon. So please keep coming to calls, meet with your local group, if you can support in any way by doing court support, court note taking, come to one of the trainings about that. Yeah, we can do this together. We can hold them to account.
Okay. And on that note, the call to action, don't just hear what's being discussed, do something about it, because we're running out of time. And every speaker here talked about a different lever we can pull. And I don't think any of us disagree that we need to pull as many levers as we can as quickly as freaking possible, because everything is at stake. Society, our lives, our relatives and entire cultures. So ending on a bit of a dour note there, but I've had such an interesting, I've really enjoyed hearing everyone's different perspectives. We have so many experts here. Massive thank you to our panel, spending time with us. All of them hugely busy, leading entire organizations, like really incredible. To everyone who came today, so many of you showed up and so many of you stayed through the whole thing. We really appreciate it. And now we're going to go into break rooms. We want to hear what you think about it. That's it for me. We're signing off. Do the panel want to say goodbye? And then we're not asking people to get off the call.
Thanks, everyone. Really, really interesting.
Lots of love.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Cheers.
Yeah, really, really good. Great evening. Thank you.
Great to meet you all. Thanks again.
Appreciate you all.